name is Lieve van Heteren. I'm the chair of the European movement in the Netherlands and also one of the conveners of a movement that's called Reclaim Europe, which we started during the last European elections because we had the same sense that we need to team up, join forces to come up with better alternatives for Europe. So welcome to our guests that just came over from Paradiso. We hope a few more will join us in a minute. A lot of people represent also organizations and initiatives. So for people to really meet and greet, we have, when you go out of the room, up the stairs, there is a lounge where after each conversation you can just sit, grab yourself a glass of wine or something else to drink and talk and discuss together the different things that are being discussed also on the podium. And the alternatives, I don't know what's happening, but there's a weather scheme here, or somebody's leaning against. That's all wonderful. This is now going around the world because we are live streamed. So whatever is being said in this room will be seen by everybody else. Hi world, it's very nice to see you. You see the technology is working. We have a full program, so I will not take up much more of your time, but on the website you can actually see all the organizations that participate. We'll mention a few when we go along this afternoon. And also to start, I want to thank a few people that have been very, very active in helping to put this together at such short notice. So all the guys of ON, of Diem, of European Alternatives, of CIP, International Students Organization. I've seldom seen such energy condensed in such a short time, so great. We'll mention every one of them. Some will moderate some of the conversations. Okay, this is a start. The first theme that we're going to discuss today, and that is a theme that occupies us all, is the question about borders. We are living in a world where at the moment all kinds of people suggest the erection or re-erection of borders. Physical borders, but also mental borders. And we feel that Europe has always sort of prided itself in being a more open society. The problem is we see on all kinds of fronts that this is under pressure. So we have a few people lined up for you. The first person that will talk about borders is one of Amsterdam's fantastic storytellers. He's an Amsterdam Kenyan world citizen. He's storyteller and also theater maker. His name is Ogutu, and he will take you to the first story. So I'll give him the floor without further ado. Ogutu, applause for you.
I actually disagree that Europe has always seen itself as being open. In fact, one of the biggest borders that Europe erected was between itself and the majority world. That it was enlightened and they deserved to be colonized and enslaved. This is a true story that traces a border that is persistent until today. On 20th October 1952, Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor of the British Kenyan colony, declared a state of emergency. Anyone suspected of taking the Mau Mau oath, the Mau Mau freedom fighters' oath, was detained and tortured indefinitely in a labyrinth of 150 detention camps known as the pipelines. There, detainees were physically and sexually assaulted, beaten. Some were even castrated. This is a true story about an ordinary man who lived during an extraordinary time in my country's history. Now, have any of you ever needed a toilet so badly that the meaning of life quite literally meant going to the loo sitting or squatting at that receptacle and listening with complete satisfaction to the rumble of thunder from your own boils? Have you? Yes? When I say asuaye, you say ya ya. Asuaye? Come on, say it with a bit of gusto. Asuaye! Asuaye! This is a true story about a man called Warutere. He is now over 97 years old, blind as a bat. But behind his dark curtains, his eyes still recall those days vividly. He was a rickshaw driver in Nairobi in the late 1940s between the Norfolk Hotel and the railway station. And he remembers that day in the late 1940s. There was a kind of congress in Nairobi. And he had made many trips between the railway station and the Norfolk Hotel and back and forth and back and forth. And after more than 20 trips, he was tired and settled in. And his friend, Wamunyinyi, who later became Reverend Canon Wafula Wamunyinyi, brought some snacks that his wife had made, and they heartily engulfed on the food and then settled in for an afternoon nap. Asuaye? 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 But thus then, Warutere was woken up by a very, very urgent need to go to the toilet. But before he could dash and find a nice bush to do his business, a Corporal Frederick Marshall, a ruthless police reservist who used to be in the army, British man, got onto his rickshaw and said to him, "Take me to the railway station post haste." Now, Marshall was not the sort of person you talked back at. He had killed many people over a whim, so forget talking back at him. What did Warutere do? Warutere picked up his steering bar and began to run. Faster! Now, ladies and gentlemen, a stomach that is filled with fermenting gases does not need to be shaken up the way that Warutere was doing. So by the time he got to the railway station, well, things were desperate. Asuaye? Asuaye? But Corporal Frederick Marshall, he did not go away immediately. He stood there by the rickshaw, holding his money, a mere penny, talking to another white man. So you must understand the social temperatures in colonial days did not allow an African to interrupt a white man for any reason at all, except perhaps to save his own life. And even then, one could still be punished. So one had to do his best not to move or attract any attention to himself. This was not good for Warutere. You see, his body temperature was increasing by the minute. A storm in his stomach gathered increasing intensity. A volcano threatened to erupt, as evident by the little bursts of air coming out of his extreme end. Oh, how he called upon the gods and the ancestors to admonish Marshall to just stop talking. But can you imagine when Marshall finished his conversations, he leisurely turned to Warutere and asked whether he had seen his friend David Banks. Have you seen David Banks? You know Banks, he's a sort of short fellow. We go hunting, we go, surely you know David Banks. Everyone knows B for Barclays, Banks have, no! Sorry, sir. No. Warutere said, trying to keep his face relaxed and his voice unhurried and respectful as a good African should, all the while becoming more aware of the looming crisis. Lucky for him, Warutere handed him his coveted coin and entered the railway's restaurant. His personal Armageddon started to become undone. No time to run out of the railway station and look for a nice place to do his business. So he looked around, left, right, center. His dear eyes landed on a sign that said, gentlemen. But as he got closer, he saw yet another sign underneath that said, "For white people only." This was a border that Warutere knew he shouldn't cross. He stood there, frozen, looking at the sign. And then he said, "To heck with it." He went into that toilet, he sat on that receptacle, he broke the borderline, and he rumbled and tumbled and thundered. Aswaye! And as you all well know, life made sense. Then Moidaga, the toilet cleaner, knocked frantically on the door, hoarsely whispering, "Where, Uma, get out, get out." Warutere wrapped up quickly, but it was just his luck that as he stepped out of the little cubicle, the very scary one and only Corporal Frederick Marshall was coming in for similar urgencies. He stopped and stared at Warutere. Warutere froze. Now, Moidaga, the toilet cleaner, who later became Warutere's friend and brother-in-law, said that each time he told this particular story, that at this exact moment, he too developed a crisis in his own stomach. Luckily for the both of them, Marshall could not hold, so he pushed Warutere aside and entered the toilet from which he had come from. Warutere picked up his stuff and fled. He hid in the town called Ziwani for a couple of days, until he was sure that no one was looking for him. And slowly, he ventured back to work. Asuaye? Yeah. But 3 days later, he was arrested and taken to the PC's headquarters, the Provincial Commissioner's headquarters. And there, he found Marshall, who claimed that one, that Warutere had been assisting the Mau Mau freedom fighters for years. And that two, that Marshall had caught Warutere trying to put a bomb in the white man's loo. And three, that when he saw Marshall, he fled. Now, as these ridiculous charges were being read out, all Warutere could think was, bomb. Since when does fermented food create a bomb? Unfortunately for him, Muidaga, the toilet cleaner, was brought in as his accomplice. And for days on after these, they endured endless forms of beating and torture. And then they were taken to the magistrate, who, in a record 15 minutes, found them both guilty, and believe it or not, sentenced them each 13 years in prison. 13 years. Warutere spent 6 of those in Mwea prison and 7 in Manyani prisons. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ogut. I think this actually, in many ways, sets the tone. But thank you very much. I cannot say anything more about that. This is absolutely fantastic as an opening. Welcome to some of our guests that have just arrived. We're having an opening session here where we talk about borders together. The next guest in this session is also a very special artist. His name is Valerio Vincenzo. And I can tell you, we have a premiere here because his book on a fantastic project called Borderline, about which he will tell you in a minute, has just come out in Paris. So he rushed from Paris to here to do the Amsterdam launch. But anyway, the project is known to some of you, and it's dealing with borders. I will not give away the punchline. Valerio Vincenzo, Italian photographer living in Amsterdam.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Does it work? Yeah. I want to go straight on the project because time is short. I want to start with a picture which does not belong to me. This is a picture from a French photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson. It's a border post between France and Belgium. This picture was shot in 1969, but it represents also the Europe that I met the first time that I moved, in fact, from Italy to France in 1995. I went to Paris for university exchange, and then I decided to remain and work there as an intern. In 1995, in fact, for an Italian to move to France and work there, it wasn't as easy as it's today. It was the beginning of 95, and I needed to ask for a work permit, in fact. The procedure was really lengthy, and I remember a number of times back and forth to the police offices. There was always a paper missing, and I remember last time I had to go there only because I had made the mistake of having signed in blue a paper that I had to sign in black. So after a long time, I finally received the permit and I could stay in France. This was the beginning of 95, and just a few months after, Italy joined the Schengen area. So all this huge castle of administrative requests just melted like snow under the sun. I decided to talk about this, and in 2007, when I became a full-time professional photographer, I went to look for this border post, and this is what I found, in fact, completely abandoned and empty. I thought, okay, this is a good idea. Maybe I should work on this. So I started in 2007 first trip, and I went. First, I did the borders of France, and I took pictures of the borders in a bit different way from what you used to see. Sometimes I don't show anything, in fact. This is the border between France and Germany. This is probably one of the most disputed places in Europe. It changed sides numerous times, and here we are. I'm shooting from a castle that is in France, but it was destroyed by the French themselves against the Germans. So it tells a lot about that. Sometimes there is nothing. Sometimes there is just a yellow dot on the pavement, as here between France and Switzerland. Today there are no more signs, in fact, just yellow dots on the floor. This is the border between Germany and Poland. This is one of the most recent borders in Europe, and today is just a pathway leading to the beach. And I think it's also one of the most beautiful images that we can have of it today. So I worked on this project for 10 years, from 2007 until a few months ago. And I went along the 20,000 kilometers of borders inside the European Union and or the Schengen area. So you're asking yourself, why? I mean, are you crazy? Why you've been doing this for 10 years? You know, why? What motivated you so much to do this? Two reasons. First of all, because I felt that there is a big lack today of positive projects about Europe. Usually, when we talk about Europe, we talk about the problems of Europe, but we tend to forget the good things of the European construction. And when in 2012 Europe won the Nobel Peace Prize for what it achieved in peace, I had calls from magazines all over the world because they had no images that talked well about Europe. So my pictures were published just because there was nothing else on the subject. This is the first reason. The second reason is because there is a big misconception of the word border today. If I go on Google and I look at the word border, and I go to Google image and I see what images are associated with the word border, this is what I get. It's a long list of walls, customizers, violence, in fact. The French geographer Michel Fouché calculated that in the world today, only 6% of the borders are barriers. 94% of the borders are empty spaces, places of freedom, as the one that I saw. So today, in fact, we are a lot biased in our head about the word border. When we think border, we associate it most of the time to images like this. So I spent all this time because I wanted to create images that we can associate with border, but also something else, like, I don't know, love, for instance, or positive things, in fact. So after 10 years, I worked on the book, in fact, and it is the kind of final product of these 10 years of work. But in fact, I realized it's just the beginning, in fact, of also a new adventure, a new activity, because today the project is also exhibits, but most importantly, I'm starting to intervene in schools. I'm doing this first in France, and I'm spreading like this project to the kids, because they are the one who needs the most of this kind of positive stories about Europe. Thank you very much.
Valerio, thank you so much. He came this morning from Paris to actually tell you this fantastic 10 years work, which is now progressing into crossing borders, because you're working a lot with youth now with this material, because images are so important. So I thank you very much. Upstairs in the lounge, we have a lounge. You climb up the stairs and it will be, Valerio will be there. Book can be shown, other images, because he has a fantastic collection. There will be a carousel playing a lot of the photos that he took. But just to remind us, in this time of walls and borders that are physical, or people proclaiming that we should have more of those, that this is actually also a reality, an imaginary that I think we need to cherish. So thank you so much for being here. We're going to move on, and it's a little bit like this till we take a short break, but I promised Dick Berlijn, who is also one of our guests, that he has to be somewhere a little after 3, so there's a hard deadline, and if a military person says so, you have to really keep it. But before we have him talking about our sense of security, we will first have a conversation about a very special award. That is the award, the Nanke Meuter Award. That will be introduced by a special column by the European Movement House columnist, Thomas van der Dunk, known to many of the Dutch people. We're very happy as European Movement that we have him monthly, also hammering away some critical sounds at us. The old-style European Movement people that I'm also one of, but Thomas is a younger style, and he definitely takes measures sometimes. He will talk about borders from a perspective of a project that he's currently working on. I'll give him the floor, Thomas.
Yeah. I first have to correct my name. It's not Van der Dunk, but Von der Dunk. Whoop. I had prepared my lecture in Dutch, but the organization was so kind to translate it last night, circa, I think. So if it's not quite good English, I'm not to blame for it. But I think it is, I wouldn't have done it better translated as it's done. Europe constitutes a precarious balancing act between 3 administrative levels: the European Union as a whole, the member states, and the regions. In the Netherlands, we tend to forget the latter dimension and focus predominantly on the duality between The Hague and Brussels. However, this triangular relation is essential. In the Netherlands, we are insufficiently aware that European Union cooperation does not only foster peace between member states, but also inside these countries. That this awareness is largely absent is due to the fact that the Dutch are very happy with their current borders. We do not know here any irredentism to speak of. The greater Dietz idea implying the annexation of Flanders is politically dead, and separatist movements do not exist here, not even among the Frisians. They are pleased enough when they can attach signs with Jouwert on the gates of their provincial capital. The only changes in the Dutch borders since the Treaty of London of 1839 sealed the division of our own United Kingdom, the only changes in the Dutch borders were Elton and Turren in 1949, the big conquest of our Prime Minister Willem Drees. Those territories were speedily returned to our eastern neighbor after 14 years, not to jeopardize our relations with just Germany, and because one cannot turn German farmers into Dutch merchants anyway. In other parts of Europe, this is quite different. Each European country knows its national minorities, of which many are not at all happy with the country in which history has planted them. The only ethnically homogeneous EU member state that does not know any linguistic minority is Portugal. It is no coincidence that it happens to be also the country with the oldest fixed borders in Europe, which have hardly changed since the 13th century Reconquista, leaving for a moment non-EU member state Iceland aside. But all other countries, from the Scots to the Catalans, but all other countries are confronted with grumbling minorities, from the Scots and to the Catalans and from the Flemish to the Corsicans. Especially in Eastern Europe and on the Balkans, the ethnic map is hopelessly complex. Around half of the Hungarians ended up outside their own country due to Trianon, 1990, and something similar happened to many Serbs after Yugoslavia fell apart in the 1990s. Each dissatisfaction with those state of affairs had not merely led to a bloody civil war in the 90s over there. It also played a major role at the outbreak of World War I and World War II, Bosnia and Danzig. After 1945, Northern Irish, Basques, but also South Tyroleans made the headlines with terrorist attacks. Those conflicts have meanwhile subsided, and in that development, the sheer existence of the European Union played a crucial role for the good. On the one hand, the EU often forced traditionally centralized states, like Italy and France and Spain, to grant minorities substantial degrees of self-governance and devolution, putting the influence of the much-hated capital at a distance. On the other hand, it abolished internal European borders, which regularly separated the minorities from their mental motherland. South Tyrol, I'm writing a book about it now, South Tyrol is an interesting case in point. If Rome is far away, and the Brenner pass wide open, it is no longer so bad to be formally an Italian. But if now we were to abolish Schengen, or if member states will exit the Union, borders would again return to the old walls they once were. And to reject regional acceptance, and with it the internal peace and stability, would come under tremendous threat. It is for good reasons that people in Northern Ireland look with trepidation at the consequences of the Brexit. People fear a revival of the Troubles. At the moment, in traveling from Dublin to Belfast, one hardly notices a crossing a state border. There's not even a signpost there. This way, the nationalists can think more or less that Ireland is one country, and the unionists that the whole of Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. This useful illusion in keeping the peace would be rudely disturbed once the border post would return. It is therefore of the highest importance to prevent this from happening. Let's not erect more walls than are already put up. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Thomas, thanks very much. This Tyrolean project he's working on, there are so many regions in Europe that are fascinating, because they have this kind of balance, and actually sometimes nations, states don't cover the cultural underpinning. So Thomas is working on that also from his art historical perspective. He will talk more about the project upstairs in the lounge. After we have our next discussion, we will take that promised break. Before we go and talk about the sense of security, which will be our second important conversation, I want to announce one special festival and award that is linked to this theme, the day the wall came tumbling down. as European movements and European initiatives, we talk a lot also amongst ourselves about the mental walls that we have in our own heads. And there is a special award every year that the European movements can give to young people that is actually sponsored by the late Mrs. Nanke Meuter, who for many, many years was a very active European movement person of the first hour. She died a few years ago, but left in her will the stipulation that every year there would be an event that targets young people to connect between the older and the younger generations. And so the Neuter family is in the hearts of many European movement people is very, very cherished. We have one member of the family here that will come to stage now because I want to give her a special applause. The family has been sponsoring this award, and I'll tell you in a minute a little bit about the festival. But first of all, welcome. Very nice that you could make it this morning. One little word about your mother. I mean, she was loved by many, many people. She died a few years back. But there was something between your mother and young people.
Yes, definitely. My mother really believed in the European Union, but also in making sure that it continues and that next generations would really continue to cherish this thought and to bring this politic and this concept into reality. And she really invested in that. And like you said, when she died, she really hoped that this thought and this project would continue for younger generations as well. Hence the award.
Okay. This year's award will go in the summer. The European movement always has a big sort of event in the middle of the year, so around June, to the winner of a bloggers festival that we're now announcing. That will be on that day. We will, in the middle of June, have a European bloggers festival, but the award will be announced on our website. So young bloggers, young means up till 30 years. So some people in the room, they might feel young, but 30 years is the threshold. They can send in blogs and will be judged by a jury that includes the family under the title of our event today. So the day the walls came tumbling down. So it is challenging young people to talk about the moment they feel in their relationship with Europe something special happened. And so storytellers might also be part of the contest if they want to be, because I think it's very important that these stories get circulated. We will announce it on the European Movement Award with photos and all kinds of stipulations, but I wanted to use the occasion, since this theme is close to the borders, to announce it here and today. And very thanks again to the Neuter family for doing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So there is a hashtag, by the way, somebody just told me. What was it again? Open Europe. So you can tweet about this event, because we're now going into the second discussion. I hope you don't mind we take it on, because we want to catch up a little bit with time, so that by 3 o'clock Mr. Berlin can leave and we can all make our way to the lounge and have a drink. He can also have a drink, so maybe you can smuggle a few minutes in, but I don't know whether it's wise to negotiate with a former military person. Dick Berlin is, for many in the room, very known. He was a former commander of the Dutch army. During the time when a lot of very complicated decisions had to be taken, for instance, to take the Dutch into the Iraq situation, to take them into the Afghanistan situation. But I've always found, I was at that time myself a politician, I've always found critical of a lot of these missions, but always found that Dick Berlin is one of the best dialogue partners on subjects to do with security, because he is willing to unpack that notion of security and safety. So, Dick Berlin, warm applause. As our guest, you sit on the yellow chair. And I'm going to call on Stijn Ettens of CIP, who is in the room. Yes, he will. So the yellow chair is yours. We put you behind I Have a Dream, so better contemplate that. Stijn has a strong interest in international affairs. CIP is one of the co-organizing organizations. It's a students' international relations organization with a lot of members. So he just yesterday finished another event on similar topics, so he's pretty exhausted but still here, which is impressive for students actually, because Sunday, so I'm very happy that you're here. We have one question that we want to share, and we let you first talk a little bit about it. And that is well, actually we have two questions. One question is, how come And can I see the next photo? Maybe I should click myself. Yes. How come that certain forms of cooperation in Europe take off fairly quickly? Like this is a photo of the Ryder Cup. I don't know, none of you is probably golfers. I'm not myself, but there is a cup that is between golfing teams. And basically there they managed without any big trouble to create a European team. So there's a European team playing an African team and an Asian team, etc. And that's called the Ryder Cup. No problems, no. European armies is a different story. So that is one sort of little sub-story. But the other more important, more fundamental question is, what do we actually do with all these security discussions that are ongoing now? I mean, and who is actually dominating maybe the debate or taking charge of the debate, and to what extent is our security discussion a useful one, or one that actually leads to anything or is hijacked by certain parties? So that will be the topic of the conversation. I'll leave it to you and I'll give you the mic.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure and also an honor. Difficult questions though. Why do some projects are easier to manage or easier to come about than others? I think in general we can imagine that all sorts of cooperation activities or projects that do not really get to your heart, in the sense that maybe your security is concerned, are easier to manage. So cultural aspects, sports events, those are fairly easy to come about, because there's not much really that is involved, I could say. When it comes to things like security, or even not talking about armies or the military, but also talking about monetary systems, the euro, for instance, then the debate becomes very difficult, because not all of the countries involved, their interests are aligned. Going back to the military, some of the European nations have different geopolitical ambitions. There's a big difference in Europe when it comes to the defense industries. We have very large defense industries in the UK, in France, in Germany. Other nations are less active in that area. And there's another very important one, which I think we need to understand. And it has to do with the question, what exactly are we trying to solve? What is the problem? What are we trying to solve? And in that sense, is a unified European army the best answer? Now, we all know that when it comes to our foreign policy, security policy in Europe, it is very difficult to completely agree on this. If we would agree on that policy, it would become much more difficult, or much easier, I'm sorry, to talk about a European defense white paper sort of thing. But I think it's fair to say that when it comes to crisis, we see that certain European nations run to the left, others are turning to the right. Some will like to follow the United States, others do not. So we don't agree on some of the fundamental issues that you need to agree on when it comes to, let's say, talking about this unified European army. That's one. The other element is this. When we talk about reorganizing our European armed forces, we have to really think, what are we trying to do? Well, in my opinion, we would like to have a European armed force that is effective. It's not a means to an end. We're not just talking about a European armed force because we like to. There's a problem and we need to fix it. The problem is the insecurity to our borders, maybe also in some other areas, and the solution to that is an effective armed forces. And then it comes to the question, what exactly is an effective armed force? You do not all need to have or to wear the same uniform and to have the same rank insignias and speak the same language to be an effective force. Purely from a military point of view, if you have the same standard operating procedures and you do understand each other, or you train together a lot, you can still have an European armed force that we have today, where different countries have effective militaries, they train together on a daily basis, and then when push comes to shove, you you bring those forces under a unified command, such as we did in countries like Bosnia or in Afghanistan, etc. So again, we need to think about what exactly is the problem, what is the best solution, and we need to also think about some of these elements that I just talked about. First of all, a policy in Europe that we all agree to as far as security and defense, security and foreign policy is concerned. And the other one, we have to consider these military aspects that I just mentioned. What exactly makes a military effective? And there's one last thing I would like to mention because I hand you the microphone, and that is an effective military army also means that you need to agree on the political level on how you're going to deploy these forces. For instance, if there's a crisis and we need a political discussion that takes half a year, the crisis is already over. So if we say we want a effective European military force, we also need to have a political body that is empowered to quickly decide. And the question then is, will all our parliaments agree to that? Okay.
Stijn, before you take the floor, I want to take maybe 2 or 3 steps back, because of course you answer this question that we put to you first and foremost from your own military perspective. That is very clear. But of course a lot of people here in the room are dealing with different ways in which we try to rethink Europe. And not only rethink Europe, but rethink Europe in relationship to the rest of the world. Now we've all followed Mr. Trump's fairly erratic remarks about Europe's this and that. We've followed the peace missions that came with some of the military high-level figures and Vice President Pence to Munich last week. But we also follow, many of us in the room, the other side to the military story and say, okay, who is actually taking charge, who is lobbying where, who is creating a crisis atmosphere on the basis of which some people get contracts to move. So there is a report that just came out from the Transnational Institute. There's a research institute here in Amsterdam that studied the lobby in Brussels, so the arms lobby so this is a very complex arena, like you rightly say, and it is not only military people. I know that you never take that position because basically you are open to that debate, but how in this room with people who are critical citizens, how do you actually A, keep up with that much wider debate, and B, maybe start a discussion about another security concept and the concept that is currently dominating all these agendas? So these are more fundamental questions. We cannot answer them in 2 minutes, but just to raise it for discussion also upstairs. A lot of us are very worried about what we see happen. There is a crisis created. You can unpack how that is being done. Some people step in, large contracts are given. Very often citizens don't even see that this is happening behind the scenes. So in that whole military arena, there are all kinds of players that are not so transparent. So how do you deal with that on top of all the things you already mentioned?
Okay, very quickly then. Yes, there of course is a very strong industrial military lobby that we have to be aware of, also in our own country, and definitely in the countries where there are bigger defense industries. But we have to look at some of the stakeholders. Then, first of all, there's the military itself. I think the military itself are primarily concerned with how do we create an effective organization. They're equally wary of the weaponized or the weapon industry, the weapons industry, as civilians are. They're equally wary of that, because they say, well, all this lobbyist about a particular airplane, armored vehicle, or whatever, we need to work with it when we have it, and can we still do our mission? I think there's a very important group that needs to see their responsibility and act on it, and that is our politicians. The politicians need to start asking the questions and come up with the answers about what exactly do we want with Europe? What do we think Europe's role is? What are the missions that are associated with that role, and which part of that role is for the military, and therefore the military needs to be equipped, it needs to be trained, etc., etc. Costs a lot of money. the politicians need to be in the first. They need to be to take the lead in this. And if they don't, if we only talk about other problems, some of the other players will start to do their lobbying and start to dominate the debate, which, in my opinion, is totally wrong. The politicians, the political elite, need to take this topic by the horns, if you will.
Stijn.
Thank you, Dick, for being here in the first place. And we are brainstorming about the conversations here on Open Podium Europe. And it came in my head, in my mind, from what do we want with Europe? Is it like, do we want big alliance? Do we want alliances between the country states? Or do we want to be stronger together but still have our own nationalism, our own nation state? Because of like European championships where each country represents itself, so there is some kind of nationalism still in Europe. But for example, the Ryder Cup is like a contest between the American golfers and European golfers. So in that case, you have like a team of 12 European golfers from all separate countries, and they're joining together in one European team against the Americans. And I was thinking, why isn't that possible on other subjects in the society? Because the European army isn't still there. Now, the first question is it desirable to have an European army? Is that what we want? On the other hand, we see we are making agreements with Germany, with Belgium, to have a navy together to change tanks, for example. We can now use the German tanks. So what do we want with Europe? Do you think it is desirable to have like a big European army, or is it more indeed like smaller cooperations between Germany and Holland, or between Germany and Belgium, for example? What is in your case the best solution for standing strong together?
First of all, I think we need to be aware that all these corporations that we see between, for instance, our navies, our armies, the Dutch, German Army Corps, and there's an equal sort of cooperation arrangement with the air forces. These are primarily focused on efficiency. So not wasting any taxpayers' money on duplicating logistical systems or headquarters, etc., which is good. But it is not the same as, let's say, creating integrated fighting units or integrating units that can deploy together. Because if you want that, you need to be constantly training together. On a daily basis, you need to see each other. So that means we would have to deploy Dutch soldiers in another country, and it costs a lot of money as well. And the fact is, can we, in the same manner, create an effective army the way we do it now? And in my opinion is we can. You should be able to train together. The only thing is that when you do deploy, you need to have the same procedures. You need to frequently train together because you need to know each other. So, but at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. We need to make sure that the money we spend on the military is not wasted. So instead of having 26 headquarters and 26 different logistical lines and 26 different training headquarters, we should try to minimize that because we're spending a lot of money. You're absolutely right. About your first remark, it's very important that we realize, again, what is the problem. The actual thing that we want to solve within a European army, a European defense organization, is a stable Europe. We want to live in a stable part of the world that is not fighting amongst each other anymore every 30 years, like we used to do in the past when we didn't talk about a unified Europe. So that is exactly what we want. Stability, long-term stability, is not created by the strength of your armed forces. It is created by making your economies work together more intensely. It is taking an interest in the stability of your neighbor's country, in taking an interest in the well-being of your partners in Europe. That creates long-term stability. And therefore, I'm very worried when we talk about disintegrating Europe or problems that we have with our monetary systems, and the fact that some leaders, between parentheses, are talking about going back to the glorious past, which is all very fine, but the truth is that with the glorious past also came the fact that we used to kill each other every 30 years, and we shouldn't forget that. So the real importance of Europe is that long-term stability. And yes, our military do play a role, but we have to think exactly what is the problem we're trying to fix, and what is the role our military need, and what is the way to come about. And it doesn't really always mean that you have to, all 26 countries, 27 countries have the same uniform. Or talk exactly the same language. We also can do it in another way, but we should try to be as efficient as possible.
Okay, final question for this short round, because this conversation will be taken to the floor. We have all heard Mr. Trump say, I don't want to mention Trump more than 3 times, so I've already overstepped my... But we've heard him say, Europe has to get its act together. Basically, you know, we should not pay for all these people being in disarray and this and this and this. Other people have actually taken this up and said, okay, maybe time has come with Mr. Trump in the White House that we can start to more fundamentally rethink all our forms of collaboration. So not try to please the Americans and say, okay, please stay with us, but basically say, okay, guys, if you want to go into isolation, that's your issue. Let's see if we can solve, and not only solve things in Europe, but also try to connect to other parts of the world. The next session will be very much about that. The world is also watching Europe in its relationship with the rest, like we heard in this fantastic opening story. So if that is also an option, what would your answer be to Mr. Trump? What would you say after, well, I don't know maybe which remark of Trump, because every day he changes his tune, but let's say to the remark, Europe has to get its act together. What would you say? Well,
the first answer I would give him that I would say he is very myopic. He doesn't really, he hasn't really studied history very well. He hasn't looked at all the efforts that the European nations have done or in collaborating with the US. He is talking about the fact that Europe is not all of our countries are paying the 2% norm, which is correct. He has a point there. But the European nations have done a lot in fighting alongside the Americans in sometimes the conflict where they played themselves a very big role in these conflicts. So that's the first remark I would have. Now going back to Europe, leaving the US out of this discussion a little bit. Yes, I do think it's important for Europe to get its act together, to be less dependent on changing policies on the other side of the Atlantic. But that means that if we really want to be an effective organization without the help and leadership of the US, then we also need to purchase some capabilities that we do not have at this time. We are heavily dependent on US command and control, US intelligence, satellites, drones, you name it. There's a whole array of systems that we do not have in Europe. So when we do say we're going to be more independent, we don't want to be as dependent as we are now on a big brother that sometimes goes left and sometimes go right. It means that we really have to step up our efforts, which in my mind is very unfortunate because we do have a lot of other priorities that we should spend our money on, whether it's healthcare or education, blah, 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 you name it. So don't get me wrong, I'd much rather be in a bigger coalition with the American friends across the Atlantic, because together we can really be an effective force, and on our own we are versplinteren. What's a good word for versplinteren? Fragmented, exactly. And it will be much more costly.
The next session will link very nicely with what we already started in the previous one, because we cannot, of course, talk about security without talking about the rest of the world. But, of course, thinking about Europe is thinking about the rest of the world. And this session is very appropriately called New Connections with the Neighbors. There are all kinds of ways in which we should connect or reconnect or connect better. And the moderator for that conversation will be Koen Ramar, who's standing here, one of the organizers. So give him an applause, because this guy has been... We have great people here, as Mr. T would say, great people. But anyway, I'll give him the floor. Koen, you introduce the rest. Go ahead.
Hello. I'm Koen Ramar. I'm a master student of Middle Eastern Studies. And lately, personally, I've felt a little bit stuck in between the problems of the old system and on the one hand, and the solutions of populist alternatives on the other hand. So I'm very pleased that we're here today to make some first steps towards a progressive future Europe. And with me are Wouter van der Staaij, who is working for the Department of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. Josh Mayo has a PhD in International Development and can tell us a lot about the African perspective. And Reina Netjes, who's a Middle Eastern correspondent and an Arabist. And together we will look at what the world needs from Europe and how we can make sure that Europe can give this. Of course, this is a very important issue for the future Europe, because there are many pressing issues, like our relationships with Russia, with America, the refugee crisis, the promotion of human rights, amongst many other things. But it's beyond the scope to deal with all of them, but we'll see what we can do today. Again, today is about making the first steps. We're completely over schedule, I think. So, Godlieve, I talked with these people already on the phone, and we can talk for ages. So you need to stop us at one point, okay?
10 minutes. I will start the way because we can make it without chef.
Okay.
An inspirational few moments, and the rest is upstairs. There's plenty of time to discuss.
Okay, we'll have a look. So we'll start with Josh, and my question is simple, Josh. What does Africa need from Europe, and how can we make sure that Europe is able to give this? I think that.
Well, if I talk to a lot of Africans, let me speak about Kenya, where I come from. They will say we don't need anything, right? How true that is and to what extent, I don't know. But one of the reasons is because of China. China is now one of the largest investors in East Africa and other parts of Africa as well, in terms of foreign direct investment, particularly in infrastructure, and of course resource extraction and that kind of thing. The consequence of that, what I would like to say, and partly because of what's happening in Europe and North America, is a decline in democracy and the rise of strong men and the abolition of term limits for presidency and repression of opposition voices. So in that sense, then the liberal democracy, the European model, is in the decline in a number of African countries. So they will say, you know, we've tried your model for 50 years, including your developmental model. It hasn't worked. We want to look east, right? And that's why Mugabe is still in power, and Museveni in Uganda, and Teodoro Obiang Nguema, those who know West Africa. But interestingly now, with his retreat from Europe and going back into, you know, a lot of time Europe told Africans, you know, get rid of your tribalism if you want to develop and create nation states. Now we look at what's happening in Europe, this reinvention of nationalism, and we think it's the same thing. You're becoming tribal in nature, which is baffling to a lot of us Africans, because Africa is now looking beyond the tribe, beyond nation, into regionalism. Right? We even changed the Organization of African Unity into the African Union to copy the European Union. And now the European Union is supposed to be falling apart. And we have regional blocks in West Africa, in East Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, copied after what's happening in Europe. We just talked about regional peace, a European foreign and defense policy. A lot of these regional blocks in Africa, I have studied regionalism in Africa, ECOWAS in West Africa, and SADC in South Africa, is that they all have a peace and security protocol, peace and security policies that they are developing after the European model. And so there is a lot of influence historically and also currently that Europe has in the development of Africa. And I personally do not think that the Chinese model or the Eastern model is the best way to go for Africa, because we still have a lot of challenges. The idea of a lot of Africans calling for a benevolent dictator, the need for a strong man, and some of them looking at Erdogan and Trump is not the way to go. So I think that a stronger, more united Europe can still have a strong influence in Africa. And reinvention of colonial spheres of influence, like the UK wants to do now, saying that we don't need Europe, we need the Commonwealth, and that is why Boris Johnson went to the Gambia as the first country that he visited in Africa, to basically invite Gambia back into the Commonwealth, because Yahya Jammeh, the dictator, had taken Gambia out of the Commonwealth. Is a reinvention of colonial empire. Now, is that what Africa wants? I don't think so. We needed the UK in Europe instead of the UK alone and reinventing its colonial empire in Africa. I could go on forever, but I will stop.
So I think we're still within your 5 minutes. So I have a quick question. You mentioned the historical ties between Africa and Europe, and you mentioned the colonial past. And you mentioned it in a positive way, but I also can see how it can be an obstacle for Europe being an inspiration, the European model being an inspiration. Is that true? Or is the colonial past not an obstacle for Europe being able to help Africa becoming a political union?
But that is why the European Union is not essentially a colonial replica of African-European relations, because of the common European policy towards Africa. Not every single European country can advance its colonial empire. So we see, although France, for instance, still has a stronger economic control over West Africa, it doesn't have a similar political control. So we see a lot of diversity, we see a lot of independence in thinking and in relations. And with the entry of China, it's balancing things a little bit to sort of release West Africa out of the grip of French economic control. So the role of a more united Europe that speaks as one body, we see these in, for instance, in relations of democratic development. I have worked with the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, which is based in The Hague and supported by a number of Dutch political parties in advancing democracy in a lot of countries in Southern and Eastern Africa, is that they work in a collaborative model with other European agencies to advance the capacity building for political parties and bringing together opposition and ruling parties, which left alone, they would never see eye to eye. Right? And so we see these collaborative models creating an atmosphere in Africa where there is collaboration between different political groupings and even between civil society and political entities as well, and encouraging ruling parties not to see civil society as the enemy of the state, in fact, and agents of foreign powers, as Russia, for example, has branded civil society. So we see the European model still having a positive influence, and a more united Europe that is more progressive, advancing liberal democracy, as opposed to this nativist nationalism, is, I think, a positive step for Africa, because the model we have, is it in Hungary, is not really the model to go for Africa, we think. Yeah.
So, briefly recap. So it's not only the model of Europe that can form an inspiration for Africa. It's also the foreign policy that Europe is how you say that, doing right now that helps Africa. So we're actually on the right way with Africa. Okay, thank you very much. Then I'll go to the Middle Eastern perspective and ask you, René Netjes, basically the same question. What does the Middle East need from Europe, and how can we make sure that Europe can give this?
The Middle East is, of course, compiled by 20 plus countries. But in general, you can say that except for Tunisia and maybe Kuwait and Lebanon, they're all repressive regimes, dictatorships. And in some way, I even have a more negative story than you have. I want to make a big change between what the people need and what the regimes need. The regimes like business deals with European companies, but the people live in repression. It depends from one country to another. But I wish we as Europe, and of course we can go in details for hours, but in short, I wish we would learn something from history. And what I mean is the following. If we look to the chaos in the Middle East now, the rise of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and it is influencing Europe, especially Europe, not so much the US and Russia, because fighters from Europe go to the Middle East and come back and do terror attacks here. Then we have the refugee flow, which started mainly because of the war in Syria. And it's not stopped yet. I mean, the war didn't stop, and the refugees the number are increasing inside Syria, also 6.3 million inside Syria. So if we look why we are in this situation in the Middle East now, that is number one, what I take from all my life being busy and studying the Middle East and talking to many people there, is the dictatorships, especially in Iraq and in Syria, but also in Libya and Egypt and other countries that have for decades denied human rights on all kinds of levels to their people, that have arrested many people at random, that have tortured and are still doing this in many places. And people rose against those dictatorships, which were unfortunately quite supported by the West. And if we look at the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda, it was horrible, of course, but Osama bin Laden always gave as his reasoning why we try to get rid of our dictatorships, okay, in a very violent way. But we see that America especially is supporting those dictatorships, and that's why we went to America to commit the attacks over there. Anyway, this is how people in the Middle East feel, or felt, and still feel, that the West is supporting their dictators. Let me go back to, if you look why we have the mess that we have, number one, I believe, is those dictatorships. Number two is the spread of Wahhabi thought from Saudi Arabia, which is still going on. Saudi Arabia is investing almost in every country to set up TV stations and to bring their thought through the world. And because for 50 years ago in Egypt and Libya you saw women wearing short skirts, yeah, you won't see that anymore. And it's because of this, mainly because of this Saudi influence everywhere. And another thing is, of course, the invasion, the US-led invasion in Iraq, who traumatized the whole Iraqi people. So many thousands have been bombed. And famous or very well-known Iraqi writer, Hassan Blassim, told me a few weeks ago. He said, before 2003, we had never heard from a car bomb. It wasn't in Iraq. The West is maybe thinking or saying, or some in the West are saying, have always been violence in the Middle East, but the car bomb thing is since 2003. And now you have car bombs every day in Iraq. And another thing is, of course, the ongoing problem in Israel and Palestine, which the West might think, oh, it's not that important, but for Arabs, it is also a thing. You know, why is that not being solved? Then I want to go to one example, especially like Egypt. Sisi is more repressive, the Sisi regime is more repressive than Mubarak ever was. We have 60,000 people in jail now, mainly civilians, 90 plus journalists. I just escaped jail. They wanted to throw me in jail, of course, as well. Then what's also not so much known in the West is that the Egyptian army, not the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Egyptian army who took over after Mubarak, released more than 800 jihadis from prison. Tunisia, the same thing. In Tunisia, 100 jihadis were released from prison in 2011 in the chaos where nobody knew what to do, and they thought, oh, let's please everyone. They just released jihadis. In Syria, it was done on purpose. Assad released at least 600 jihadis, and they went to Raqqa and everywhere because he was afraid. He could not suppress the demonstrations. He was afraid that the West would take him, like the West had taken Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein. And he thought, if I just release all these jihadis, they will concentrate on them and not on me. And he succeeded in this. He also had sent 2,000 jihadis to Iraq to sabotage all the operations of the Americans over there. So he has a history of doing this.
Elena, can I just quickly, because I hear a lot about what we shouldn't do. These dictators are bad, we should stop supporting them.
What should we do?
So we should
all this long introduction is, let's not go on this way. Let's not keep on supporting these dictatorships, like in Egypt, because on Mubarak we had 10,000 jihadis, now 10,000 prisoners, now 60,000. We are breeding new jihadis as we speak because of all this suppression in the Middle East. So what we should not do is help these dictatorships. By the way, the regime is killing more civilians than even ISIS and Al-Qaeda do in Egypt altogether, far more. And by dealing and selling them weapons, what Holland is not doing so much, but also, especially France and the UK, of course, are selling loads of weapons to France now, more than the US to Egypt. you help this dictatorship, you help these repressive regimes who are the main reason of all this chaos in the Middle East. That's my point.
One person here who's accused of being helping these regimes at the moment. So maybe you can explain why we are doing this and if we are doing this.
Well, let me start off by saying good afternoon. My name is Wout van der Staaij. I work at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I think our minister is quite clear about this. He's really worried about the human rights situation in Egypt. The Netherlands is actually one of the few countries with the strictest weapon export regimes within Europe. So saying that I personally or the Dutch ministry is supporting human rights violations in Egypt would not be true. But I guess your point is really valid. The situation in the Middle East, but also in Africa, is to some extent really worrisome. Allow me first to take some positive things about from your contributions. That is the claim that the EU has a role to play in improving the lives of individuals, both in Africa and in the Middle East. Not necessarily states, but being able to ameliorate the lives of Africans and Arabs. I think that's a positive thing. I started working at the ministry a year ago, and it was quite an interesting year. Of course, we had continuing unrest in Ukraine after the illegal annexation of Crimea, the rise of ISIL, the continuing war in Syria, with, of course, the fall of Aleppo at the end of the year as the absolute low point, but also the crisis in Libya. And then in June, there was the British population who voted to leave the European Union. And 2 days later, on Saturday, I think it was the 26th of June, the High Representative of the European Union published a new strategy for Europe's foreign policy. It's called the Global Strategy, and the first line of the strategy reads as follows. It says, the purpose, even existence of our union is being questioned. Yet our citizens and the world need a stronger union like never before. And I think this is really true, because yes, Europe might be disintegrating, and after Brexit, a lot of people really thought so. But problems like climate change, unrest in Ukraine, unrest in the wider Middle East region, but also increasing amounts of refugees and migrants coming to Europe really require us to work together. And when we're talking about alternatives for the European Union, I think this global strategy really has some value. Mr. Berlijn already said that creating foreign policy within Europe is quite difficult. And this global strategy is actually a good start at being able to conduct a joint foreign policy. One of the most innovative parts about it is that it starts with the interests of individual citizens, so of European citizens, that are shared across the Union. So these are 4 interests. First of all, we have an interest in being secure. We have an interest in keeping our prosperity. We have an interest in having or living in a resilient democracy. And fourthly, we have an interest in a global order that is based on rules. Well, starting with these interests, we then formulate 4 principles to jointly, relate ourselves to the world. These principles are then unity. As European countries, we should work together. We should take responsibility. That's the second principle. Thirdly, we should engage with the rest of the world. So don't, like as in the Netherlands, we would say, go behind the dikes, no, but engage with the rest of the world. And fourthly, do that in partnership with the rest of the world. So these ideas, I think, are quite good. But then the practice comes in. And the British have a really nice saying. They say, we now have a hymn sheet, but we should now show the will to sing. And that is exactly what's happening with the European global strategy. We have all the nice ideas, we have the principles and the priorities and the interest, but now Europe should start working together and actually do the things that we should do. So this is a long introduction, but I see some encouraging things happening at the moment. European security, that's what the previous discussion was about. We see that for the past few months there have been lots of debates in Europe about how we can work together more efficiently. I think Europe spends about half of what the US spends on the military, but our output is only 15% of what the US has. So it means there's huge inefficiencies in the system, and we're currently working to get rid of that. And that would make sure that Europe is more, better able to take care of the neighborhood. Maybe one final thing, relating to the Wahhabi thought as well. One of the key elements of the strategy is that, what happens inside of Europe is closely connected to what's happening outside of Europe. So the internal-external dimension is really emphasized. So that means that if we don't have our own house in order, if we don't have our inner cities in order, we risk having external actors being able to influence our internal security. And I think this is also really an important issue or element of this strategy, because it explains that we have a clear need to, get our house in order, but also relate ourselves to the rest of the world.
I have many questions.
Yes.
Especially from the Middle Eastern case.
Go.
It's nice to hear that Africa is more positive about this foreign policy, but in the Middle East, obviously a lot goes wrong. But let's just finish off with one more question from the Middle East, from Reina.
Yes, I'd like to react, of course, because we talked shortly now. Holland especially and Sweden are doing a lot of positive things. They try. Also in the NIMD, I don't even know what the abbreviation. NIMD, yes, they try to set up projects in Egypt, but all the workers in Egypt now have a travel ban, and they are afraid to being thrown in prison. So actually, it works for them negatively now. The regime in Egypt is so difficult. I realize that, but. And I also agree that our minister has a very positive view, but he is in a coalition with the VVD, who wants to pay money to Sisi to stop refugees going. So he wants to award the regime for what he's doing. So I understand this very difficult point. And what I would advise is, really support Tunisia, because Tunisia is on the right way. And I have to say that because of all these business deals, because of the Suez Canal being built, which made Egypt more in debt, they didn't benefit anything to the country. Holland is supporting these regimes, and we are selling weapons to the navy. That's what the government wants, because otherwise they are afraid to lose the competition with other European countries. And I think you legitimize the regime by doing this. That's my point.
Okay. Since I'm the timekeeper, there are a lot of questions. The setup for people who came a little later of this is we have inspirational conversations. So now, of course, a lot of people have questions. Keep these questions for there will be a break upstairs, lounge, where you can talk in much more depth with the speakers, because we can take quick questions, but then that will be just too narrow. I think basically we will take the whole discussion to the lounge. So if it can wait for 20 minutes, you can have, is that right? Difficult.
I miss one very important aspect of the problems in the Middle East. And journalism has not spoken about the major reason why Saddam Hussein and Libyan Gaddafi were attacked by the United States, by the Americans, because they both threatened to pay their oil in euros and yen. They wanted to abandon the petrodollars, which is the cork on which the American power floats. That's why they were attacked. And over the last years, I haven't heard a word about it.
I'm actually looking at one of the next speakers, because after this conversation, we immediately move on to the financial order.